everybody. My name is Naomi Ndiaye. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, and I am the founder of the Black Baroque project. This is the first event of the Black Baroque project for 2022, but not the last, and we are really happy to get started again. There is coffee, there are cookies behind you. Please help yourselves, don't hesitate. Rachel, we have some more people coming in. This event is being recorded, and the Zoom recording will be made available on the Black Baroque YouTube channel. This event is made possible by the generosity of the Division of the Humanities here in New Chicago, and we are very grateful to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, especially Riley, as well as Tracy Matthews and Tiara Kirkpatrick for co-sponsoring and hosting today's event. I cannot thank enough Rachel Willis, who let in most of you. In addition to being a brilliant PhD student in the English department, she's doing a masterful job at managing the BDP. None of this would be possible without her. So thank you, Rachel. And last but not least, of course, I want to thank our distinguished guests, Kajahl and Cecilio M. Cooper, whom I will properly introduce in a minute. But first, I would like to say a few words about the Black Baroque project. The Black Baroque project was created in 2020. It will keep running for another 5 years. And it platforms Black identifying contemporary artists who work with, against, and through Baroque aesthetics as they reckon with our own cultural moment. Last year, we hosted artists working in the medium of live performance. We had actor and director Keith Hamilton-Cobb, actress Debrianne Bird, and choreographer and dancer Bintou Dembélé. This year, we are turning our attention to visual artists. As I have said before, there is a tension or a slash at the core of the phrase Black Baroque, because the Baroque is historically a time period that set the foundations for the white supremacist and anti-Black regimes in which we live today, with the development of settler colonialism, color-based slavery, and the transnational invention of whiteness. In visual and decorative culture, Baroque aesthetics yielded representations of Afro-diasporic people that often underlined their beauty, but also objectified and commodified them, as pre-modern critical race studies scholars like Kim F. Hall and Peter Erickson have showed in their work on Black humor figuration in early modern miniature jewels and aristocratic portraits. These are just two examples of such early modern miniature jewels that are thoroughly studied by Kim Hall in Things of Darkness. Actually, it is perhaps in visual culture that the early modern literal and symbolical commodification of the Black body that was becoming racialized is most palpable, most visible. And yet, there is simply no denying that Baroque aesthetic codes based on beautiful irregularity, characterized by complexity, surprise, dizzying folds, metamorphosis, illusions, perpetual movement, self-referentiality, and the lavish profusion of carefully contrived ornaments in a number of artistic media have appealed to and been reclaimed by artists of the African diaspora. Moreover, as we strive to reckon with this highly generative tension, the slash in the Black/Baroque, we are hailed by French Caribbean and philosopher Edouard Glissant, an influential figure in Black studies who thought about the Baroque in his masterful poetic subrelation as an epistemology, as a mode of knowing and by extension of existing in the world that is radically open. And I'm going to cite him at length here, but you can follow the quotation on the screen. The Baroque made its appearance in the West at a time when a particular idea of nature as harmonious, homogeneous, and thoroughly knowable was in force. Rationalism refined this conception, one convenient to its own increasing ambition to master reality. At the same time, the spectacle of nature was supposedly something one could reproduce. Knowledge and imitation set themselves up as mutual guarantors. The idea of imitation presupposed that beneath the appearance of things, but basic to them, there lay the same depth, some indubitable truth, led to primarily by the sciences and more closely represented in art, to the extent that these representations systematized their reproductions of reality and recognized the legitimacy of its aesthetics. Thus, the revolution in perspective in paintings from the beginnings of the Quattrocento was conceived of as moving toward this depth. And this is where things get really relevant here. Against this tendency, a Baroque rerouting emerged and thrived. Baroque art was a reaction against the rationalist pretense of penetrating the mysteries of the known with one uniform and conclusive move. A Baroque shudder, via this rerouting, set out to convey that all knowledge is to come, and that this is what makes it of value. Baroque techniques, moreover, would favor expansion over depth. This historically determined rerouting generated a new heroism in the approach to knowledge, a stubborn renouncement of any ambition to summarize the world's matter in sets of imitative harmonies that would approach some essence. Baroque art mustered bypasses, proliferation, spatial redundancy, anything that flouted the alleged unicity of the thing known and the knowing of it. Anything exalting quantity infinitely resumed and totality infinitely ongoing. The historical Baroque constituted thus a reaction against so-called natural order, naturally fixed as obvious fact. End of quotation. As a result, Édouard Glissant sees the Baroque as an epistemology that is not located historically as a one-time event in the age of Counter-Reformation, but as a dialectical process that recurs transhistorically. All human culture, this is him, all human cultures have experienced a classicism, an age of dogmatic certitude, one that henceforth all must transcend together. And every culture, at one time or another in its development, has contrived Baroque disturbances against this certainty. I love this term, Baroque disturbances. And each transcendence of this certainty was prophesied and simultaneously made possible by means of these disturbances. This is poetics of relation. That interpretation of Baroque culture and aesthetics might help us understand in what sense the Baroque constitutes a resource for contemporary artists. On the Black Baroque project, we want to hear from artists who reckon with the complexity of the slash, right? What Black/Baroque means. And we curate conversations between such artists and scholars who are best positioned to help illuminate those artists' worlds for us. The scholar in question today is Cecilio M. Cooper. Cecilio M. Cooper is a Forsyth postdoctoral research fellow with the University of Michigan's History of Art Department and an American Antiquarian Society - National Endowment for the Humanities fellow. Previously, they have taught for English and Africana Studies at Tulane University, as well as the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Cooper is currently preparing their first book manuscript, which is tentatively titled South of Heaven, Surface, Territory, and the Black Chthonic. By engaging visual cultures of alchemy, demonology, cartography, and beyond, the book examines the occulted role Blackness plays in cosmological constitutions of subsurface space from the 13th century onwards. Their research has been supported by such institutions as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the John Carter Brown Library, and Yale Center for British Art. And they have presented their scholarship at the American Studies Association, MLA, Brown, Princeton, McGill, University of Texas, Austin, King's College London, among others. There is incredible range to their research, and this is a tantalizing book project. You will soon see why Cecilio is the perfect interlocutor for Kajahl. Kajahl. Through painting, Kajahl resurrects objects that are lying dormant in historical archives. Kajahl's portraits combine iconography from African, Asian, European, and pre-Columbian traditions. He endlessly scours and sifts through books, online images, and visits museums in order to gather source materials. He takes these finds from his excavations and hybridizes entities that eventually become grandiose figures. Although the characters he constructs belong to a multiplicity of time periods, and you will see it's not just the Baroque, there's also Middle Ages, Antiquity, it's all in there, locations and cultures, they foreground the forgotten past and reanimate minor artifacts of history into what amounts to a transformative assemblage. For Kajahl, painting is a place where we can traverse different cultures and temporalities as a way to challenge our ideas about how we see ourselves and others. His work questions the boundaries of identity by treating painting as a site where radical mixtures, overlooked history, and speculative fiction come into play. And here I'm quoting him again. His paintings take us to a time before race existed by opening up to the chaos and complexity, expanding the periphery around how we perceive ourselves in the past and present day. The figures themselves, and you will see many today, are semi-fictional, composed of artifacts from history, yet in their totality, they do not represent figures from real history. As deeply invested in the artifact themselves and their respective history, Kajahl is ultimately interested in how the combination of objects become a more accurate reflection of who we are. They transcend what confines or limits us in this reality and open us to the possibilities of who and what we can become. Kajahl received his education from, he got his BFA from San Francisco State University, studied in Florence for a year, in Florence, and then an MFA at Hunter College, New York. He's been the recipient of numerous awards and residencies, the Lower East Side Printship in New York, Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans, Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptures Grant in New York. His work has been featured in exhibitions for over 10 years now in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Miami, DC, Belgium, and Johannesburg, South Africa. And some of those exhibitions have really evocative titles for our purposes. Just a couple of them: The Black Portrait, Beauty, Respect, and Mining Memory, 2020. He had his first solo exhibition exactly 10 years ago at the University of North Carolina. And since then, a bunch of them, Obscure Origins in 2017, Unearthed Identities also in 2017. I want to pay special attention to the 2020 solo exhibition, Royal Spectre, which took place here in Chicago at the Monique Meloche Gallery. Monique is not with us today, but you saw her yesterday. I'm just going to cite an excerpt from the exhibition catalog for that exhibition that I found particularly illuminating. Baroque images of the blackamoor, well, we'll get there in a second. Baroque images of the blackamoor are used by Kajahl as source material, now reanimated through elegant paintings of warriors, scholars, scientists, and oracles, all rendered with painstaking detail and elevated to a grandiose status. Disconnected from their original historical context, these blackamoor sculptures are reimagined through a hybridized narrative, creating fantasy paintings about a fantasy. They are reborn as theoretical rulers in a bygone era, with Kajahl positioned as the appointed court painter of their mythical domain. And this is a metaphor to which he returned in the most recent solo exhibition, the 2021 Tabula Rasa exhibition at the Richard Keller Gallery in LA, where, and here again I'm reading from the catalog, you are taking on the endeavor as an artist commissioned by the highest court in the land. Kajahl is tasked with painting a council of philosophical dignitaries. And at some point, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what it means for you to identify with the figure of the early modern court painter. Right? I'm going to go quiet in a minute and yield the floor to Cecilio, who is much more competent than I am to help us explore Kajahl's world. But before I do, let me just explain briefly the decision that informed the design of the poster for today's event. For the first conference I ever organized when I was a graduate student, we decided to put on the poster this painting on the left, 17th century painting by Dutch master Govert Flinck, which shows it because this portrait raises a number of questions about the intersection of portraiture, subjectivity, and Blackness in Baroque culture. If the portrait is the visual genre that is supposed to capture a person's subjectivity, then what does it mean that we cannot see this man's face? Are we to read it as an act through which the painter denied this Black man a subjectivity by representational means, or are we to read it as an act of fugitivity by which the possibly enslaved Afro-Dutch subject deliberately, if subterraneously, resists capture and surveillance? On the poster for today's event, we use the image on the right. We decided to use, it's silent incantation 1, right? We decided to use this image where Kajahl is citing, recirculating, or perhaps invoking through a secret incantation, the Baroque idiom that is at work in Flink's work. And yet, on that image, you're not just citing it, you are complicating it, further complicating the question of Black subjectivity. So I'm just going to take a look at silent incantation here. While through the eminently Baroque motif of the Baroque, we can now finally see the Black man's face, which is so often the cornerstone of Western conceptualizations of subjectivity. At the same time, the man's enslaved condition is made explicit by the slave collar that he is wearing, as well as the texture of his skin that evokes the bronze of Baroque blackamoor statues, framing him as an object, beautiful, yet object nonetheless. The model is here again caught in the dialectic of the subject versus object that characterizes the Black Baroque. But in this case, you are directly implicating us in this line of questioning, because the angle of the mirror suggests that we too are in part reflected here. So thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. I will yield the floor to Kajahl and Cecilio. They will converse for about 45 minutes, right? After which they will take questions for about 30 minutes. And folks on Zoom, thanks for joining us. Don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A box. If the Q&A box doesn't work, just comments. We will read your questions and they shall be answered. Cecilio, whenever you need me to change images, just signal and I will make it happen.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank Noemi for that wonderful introduction, and of course providing some really rich context for that allows us to really delve into Kajahl's work. So I thought I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you and learn some more about your practice, your orientation to think about making images and engage its history and a variety of things. But I thought it'd be great for to let the audience have an opportunity to learn some more about you. So can you just begin by just telling us some more about your personal background, your educational training, and some of your professional experience?
Yeah, I'll probably start out by talking about my parents, and that's probably how I kind of got into all this. So my father's from Belize, and he's sort of like, he would probably describe himself as a Garveyite, but sort of Rastafari-esque, Garveyite-esque, an artist, a musician in his own right. So that was one figure that was an influence on my life. And then my mother is Italian-American origin. And prior to having me, for 7 years, lived in Morocco. This is like the late 60s, early 70s. It was prior to my father married to a Moroccan magician. And they traveled for years all over Northern Africa, Europe. They went as far as, I want to say, Afghanistan and Nepal, and she was his assistant. So she would get like levitated and they chopped in half, and they even performed at the Taj Mahal, for example. Lived in India as well. So they, after having all these experiences and coming from these different places, came together and had me. And in our house, had some of these. I've heard stories about these travels and listened to music from, so it gave me a very globalized perspective. Although I did grow up in Santa Cruz, which is on the west coast of California. So it was the influence of her travels throughout North Africa and the Middle East and Europe, and my father having this kind of like Garveyite, NOI background, all coming together. That's probably what stimulated a lot of my curiosity early on. And I think what happened in hindsight is, I went through the public education system, and they didn't talk about any of this stuff that I was sort of privy to as a child. And it made me kind of want to question, well, what is all this stuff that I was kind of hearing my parents talk about? And later on, I went to San Francisco State for undergrad, and that's where I started painting, and I started to really delve into art history and focus my time on painting. And through my study of art history, I learned about how many artists from particularly the Renaissance period left where they were at and studied in Italy. So, okay, great. That's what I have to do. So my senior year, I went and I studied abroad in Florence. And that really opened up my eyes to, it was like prior to, it was taking art history in a classroom, much like this, where we're just looking at slides of art, opposed to in Italy, you know, you're going to the Uffizi, you're going to the Palazzo Pitti, you're seeing all of these images up front in person. And that, again, really kind of expanded art history.
Yeah, that sounds like a really rich background, and I can see resonances in terms of the geographic expanse of maybe some of the places where parents have kind of chance to venture, and some of the way that you're doing space in your work. And I'm also thinking about the meshing of politics, about Garveyism, and then also magic, and about esoteric things. So I want to invite you to elaborate some more on telling us about how you think that has shaped your trajectory in terms of your kind of signature way of approaching making it.
Yeah, I think in terms of like temporality, it allowed me to look outside of maybe the current paradigm.
Okay.
And like spurred my fascination in different cultures that were outside of my own, and time periods that weren't in close relationship to what I was dealing with now. And I do see my art as sort of a porthole into another, almost kind of like an idea of a metaverse, into a different creation of a different world. So I sort of want to escape the here and the now, a form of positive escapism, escape the here and now, and kind of create a porthole into another realm.
Excellent. I'm thinking about a realm. I'm seeing here about this mirror image, which again shows up in terms of that kind of referentiality, in terms of painting. We have a reference to a Baroque sculpture. Can you tell us more about what are the different mediums that you're engaging? When I go to Italy, there's certain kind of things that were present there in terms of the great works, but I see painting, I see sculpture, maybe you also work in collage and photography. Can you tell us some more about just what elements that you kind of pull together?
Yeah, I think that this is probably a good opportunity to talk about my creative process, which really starts with doing research. And it's very loose. I wouldn't describe myself as a historian, but I'm doing research into various points in time. And as I'm doing so, I'm collecting imagery that coincides with what I'm researching. So I might find imagery via the internet. I might go to a bookshop and like pour through rare books. Obviously, going to museums is my favorite thing to do, is sourcing imagery from the artifacts themselves. So that's led me on a whole journey of different places in the world and going to different ethnographic museums. Like I can think of one instance when I went to the Anthropological Museum of Jalapa, Mexico. And there, I think it houses like 9 of the 19 colossal Olmec heads, for example. And just standing like face to face with these artifacts, there's like kind of an energy that these things have, and there's a different relationship when you're face to face via just seeing it. So, anyways, so I'm sourcing a lot of imagery. I have a historical archive that I've now been working with for about 10 years, and there's over 100,000 images in that archive.
Yeah.
So I'm collecting images from wherever I can find them, and then I'm kind of carefully, there's a vetting process that goes through, because there's a lot of hoax artifacts, there's a lot of art, so just vetting them for their authenticity, I guess. And then I'm carefully organizing these artifacts into very specific folders. And those folders pertain to maybe the angle at which the photograph is taken. Is this a bust? Is this a headdress? Is it a piece of jewelry that I could potentially use? And then from there, the collage process happens. And that's where a lot of the magic happens in this process, where I'm layering images on top of each other, altering the opacity, like rotating, flipping, cutting, trying to really come up with the combinations that, again, become like a sketch or a blueprint, or maybe the best way to describe it is a jump-off point for a painting. And that process, I oftentimes bring up the analogy of like songwriting, where sometimes the images I'm just like channeling, and I just have to show up and be present, and then the images find each other. And it's paying attention to what's happening in that archive and what I'm seeing in front of myself, because the combinations are oftentimes happening in my mind. I'll be looking at an image, and then another image from the 100,000 thousands of images will pop up and come together. So, for example, I have some sketches that I've been sitting on for years now, and then sometimes I'll come up with a sketch in like 2 days. Like I really feel like I have no control over it. So, and that's where my studio looks like fairly pristine as far as like most painter studios go. But my digital studio is a mess. I mean, if you looked at my desktop, there's just hundreds of images on there at all times. It's really hectic and chaotic, but out of the chaos comes these ideas. So from there, once I'm like confident with an idea or a sketch, that becomes the impetus. I use the jump off point, the blueprint for painting, and then I'll use that as a guide point for painting.
Okay. So when you're doing that process, do you employ digital technology as a, I know you sort things in a particular type of way. Do you do digitally? Do you have the programs you use?
Yeah, I use Photoshop.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the computer program that I use. It's funny I should mention this, I really don't like working on the computer. There becomes a point where I have to get off that thing. I love to paint. I like the object of a painting versus like kind of a digital collage. I'd like to think that the painting renders the digital collage obsolete. Another metaphor I would use is the digital collage. It's almost like a roadmap. And I'm traveling from point A to point B. And on that journey, maybe part of the map gets ripped off, or I use a lighter, and then part of the journey gets burned, and I have to improv my way through that journey to the destination point. So it's painting the thing is hard enough, so it helps to kind of somewhere have some direction of where I'm going. Yeah.
Ask you more about scale. I saw there's a photo on your site of when you're painting, they're like massive, like the size of half of the wall, versus I'm showing you using a computer screen. It's a small. How does scale affect?
I think that kind of, there's another point I wanted to make that ties into the question you just asked me, but also the fact that I'm using oil painting and I'm using a lot of these really age-old traditions and techniques that were used during the Baroque period, such as chiaroscuro and indirect methods of painting. Really connected and ingratiated with the history of painting. So I don't see any disconnection between myself and my practice and those painters that came from the Baroque. I think if they were alive today, Caravaggio, Rubens, Veronese, they would be doing the same thing. And it's funny because we brought up the David Hockney Secret Knowledge, and that was an investigative case of how artists were using the most state-of-the-art technology at that time to aid in the technical practice of their work. So I think if they had Photoshop, they would definitely be using it.
We're taking. That makes sense. So you mentioned some of these Italian Baroque artists. What other lineages in which do you plot yourself in terms of other traditions of image makers, in terms of intellectuals, of people working other kind of creative expression? Where do you situate yourself?
Well, I mentioned that I feel very connected to them, but also, Dadaism used collage. So there were a lot of surrealism as well. So there's a lot of other histories of art that I do feel connected to, not just the Baroque. But it's funny, like contemporary art today, you don't hear a lot of artists reference the Baroque. It seems sort of outdated to some degree. That's how they would do it, yeah. But there's no shame in connecting yourself to surrealism. You don't see tons of artists that are like, oh yeah, I'm a surrealist. But there's not that like stigma around it, maybe is the word I use.
Why do you think there's a stigma?
I think it has to do with the subject matter, the kind of religious iconography, and how art has become so secular today. Like academic art is looked at as very kind of outdated. Whereas surrealism, I think, is maybe more suited to the contemporary level today.
I want to continue that thread, and maybe this is a great time to see the slides. So you know,
Sure.
Alright, so this is libation. I'd like to hear more about how you, I see ideas around not only surrealism, but also the speculative, or you're working with the fictional or the esoteric. Can you talk some about how that factors in dramatically in works like libation?
You know, I make the image and then I figure out what it is, why I did it, what I meant by it. I like, it's important for me that my paintings raise more questions. I think good art raises questions, that doesn't necessarily answer them. So with almost all my work, there's like kind of a riddle that I think is involved in it, where I'm not necessarily sure who this character is and necessarily what they're doing either. But I like how the paintings make my imagination kind of run wild. And I like when the viewer steps to one of my paintings. It doesn't necessarily try to like categorize it or historicize it, but just lets their imagination kind of go crazy.
Yeah, one of my interests in looking at just visual imagery from this particular early modern period. It was about the iconography, it's about decoding certain kind of references that are not legible to everyone. There's something secret or hidden about that. And so think about libation offering potentially to ancestors that I think is working in kind of the subtext of this. Also the kind of, there's a meshing of the accoutrement in it, references some of the studies and laboratories of some great thinkers of various traditions, but also there's different things that are happening with their figure in this particular image. Could you talk some about what other traditions, you mentioned Olmec, you put the Italians, what other things are happening here, or maybe some of the
Yeah, well, Naomi brought up the Black Baroque, and this is a marvel. The face, so maybe I should also mention, what you're seeing is a fusion of many images in my work. So also within my creative process, I state sort of rules or laws that govern it. For example, each image is comprised of no less than 3 images. And I rarely include images that are of the same civilization. So they oftentimes come from different civilizations that are comprised to make the image. So oftentimes you can't necessarily tell where one image or artifact begins and the other ends. So for example, in this painting, and I'm also incorporating etchings, engravings, painting, photographs of artifacts. So I'm pulling all these things into a painting and trying to make it at least feel like a convincing image. An important element for me in my work is bringing these images, bringing these figures to life, going into these historical archives and taking what's been lying dormant and like resuscitating and reanimating them. To bring it back to the idea of oil painting, to me, oil painting is a metaphor for life. There's life and energy in paint. And again, that's what a digital image doesn't have. So I want you to feel that this is an image, this is a figure that's like sentient, and that breathes, for example. So yeah, they're holding a libation cup with like some sort of red serum, and this painting comes from the show I did last year at Richard Heller called Tabula Rasa, and they're holding a scroll, and then there's an open book as well. So there's, yeah, like you said, a lot of accoutrements of.
Yeah, I was just seeing on chemical study, like it's very serious of what the red is. I appreciate that. Maybe we can go on to the next one. So we got this particularly captivating Ocean Guardian. Maybe we can talk some about how you employ landscape and space. We have representation of interior space of the domestic. Also, there's someone you look very experienced in terms of land, but also we have kind of a rare image of aquatic oceanic scene. Mesh of time periods, it's like a dinosaur. There's a different palette happening here. Can you tell us something about what's happening?
Part of it was moving back to the coast, moving from New York, which is like dense urban, back to like, you know, a coastal town where I can see the ocean every day. And that's had, I think, a profound impact on my work. Probably this is a good time to talk about really how I see like the history of painting, also the Baroque, is through fiction and anachronisms. So one of the things that inspired me with this painting was the genre of the four continents, where many artists have depicted the four continents: Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And what I find so fascinating about this genre of work is how they depict Americans looking like Africans and Europeans looking like Asians and Africans looking still sort of like Africans. But I'm like, why? Wait, what? And then they're riding like dinosaurs, like these really trippy figures that don't even exist for me. They're totally out of their imagination. So again, when I see myself connected to the past, that's sort of what I mean is it's almost a reinterpretation of these paintings done in like 2022 of these kind of Blackamoor-esque figures riding them. This is like what in the mind of the European back then. They never traveled to places as far as Africa. These were like totally mythical realms to them. They thought that this was possibly happening. So again, this figure, there's probably like 12 different images that I used to create this image. Like for example, the headdress I got from a painting from Jean-Baptiste Tiepolo. And this was one of his fresco paintings in Venice, that colorful headdress. So in terms of the color, I mean, I'm using glazing techniques. And glazing was invented in around like 1420s by Jan van Eyck. And it's this, again, this process of an underpainting, kind of a monochromatic underpainting, and then you're layering thin, transparent layers on top of that many layers. That's how you're able to get these deep, rich colors that you kind of can't really get through direct painting, which is like what I think about impressionism, for example.
Is there anything we're missing that if we saw it in person, is there in terms of luster? If we saw it in person?
Well, there's a lot of texture.
Okay.
And that's another reason why I really like oil painting is it's so versatile, and the textures and the surfaces that you're able to achieve via oil painting, you're not able to really achieve in any other kind of medium. So you're definitely missing out on that. And you mentioned scale earlier. This painting is this right, 7 by 5.5 feet, so it's quite large. So you really have to like, step back.
Why is that important for you to paint that scale?
Well, scale can do two things. Like if it's a small painting, it really draws you into the piece. So it makes you kind of huddle around it and get very close to it. And if it's large, it does the opposite. It makes you want to stand back in order to like, take the entire thing. So you can kind of play with your audience even depending on the scale of the thing, but it's also the magnitude of the image.
It makes me think about where a lot of the Baroque imagery that we're familiar with, who are the intended audiences and where they would be typically displayed. And that's different from, I think, you have thoughts on that about who your intended audiences are, the difference between where your work could be displayed versus some typical audience.
Not necessarily. Yeah, I'm pretty open to that.
Okay, excellent. I think what's really wonderful is that some of the things we're seeing with the advent of the internet, people we're not going to see in person can experience it, but also you have upcoming shows. When it's in a group show, it's contextualized a certain way, but also it's wonderful. It's a 10-year anniversary of your first solo show, and we have another one that's going to be coming up that we're going to get into a little bit later.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until you mentioned that. I was like, 10 years ago.
That's really great. So let's see. Can we talk some more about? Let's maybe move on to the next image. That'd be really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is a painting I made in 2016. It seems like a long time ago. So the headpiece is actually it's called a hacha, and it's made out of basalt rock from the Olmec people again, Veracruz, Mexico. And the bust had a fine spot in a town called Ruvo, Italy. It was probably made during the first or second century BC. It comes from Italy. And it's this sort of like pinkish, I don't know how faded the colors got over time, but pinkish albino like figure depicting an African. And I think the lower torso came from an Alexander Roslin painting, a Swiss painter.
Anything you'd like to share about the fabric?
I mean, I like the combination of all the textures. That again, we have like Baroque, basalt. I'm thinking about Baroque too damn much. Basalt with the what looks like a skin color, but really is a plaster bust. And then all the textures of the fabric, just a combination. I thought made for a striking image.
Yeah, I'm seeing embroidery, and we talked some about the beginning and ends of the silkworm. Back to some of the other kind of talking about. So I see just material, different kinds of things in a single image, and the juxtaposition of the two kind of head faces in opposite profile, signaling east and west. There's just a lot of things there.
Jet form, yeah.
It's really great. Do you have anything you want to share with us about how you deal with temporality and space, like in Broadway? We talked about anachronism. We talked about we were talking about the pieces about layering, cutting, and flipping. I think is a reference to your method. Can you speak some more about like the Shannon space here? What else are you doing with temporality?
It's almost like every painting becomes. It's almost like an accident. Right, like when I'm coming up with these combinations, it almost catch me off guard every time. I'm like, oh, whoa, or sometimes I don't even catch it at first. I almost thought it was a mistake, and then I just toss it off to the side, and then I'll look at it 2 days later, and I was like, oh, whoa, that was pretty good, you know. So you mentioned something else. I went off on a little bit of
It's
tangent,
okay.
but
It's okay.
but you mentioned temporality.
Yeah.
So maybe we could talk about that. We might be getting ahead of ourselves slightly, but. Again, I mean, we're all the three of us are really interested in like the deep past, and there's kind of a disconnection. But I'm interested in how these objects come back to us through space and time, and we have this like 21st century lens that we view, the world politically through. That wasn't how it was back then. So oftentimes the term for it is called presentism, but we superimpose our current view of like, let's just say in this case, racial relations. And we superimpose them onto the past, but that's not, they didn't see the ancient world didn't see itself through how we racial relations now. You mentioned how in the Baroque, how the way we see race now was sort of formed to some degree at that period of time. We're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, during the Enlightenment. But we were talking about earlier how the term Black didn't necessarily exist in the medieval and the Hellenistic world, for example. Terms like atheot, for example, were used for Black people. Atheot meant burnt-faced people. It wasn't necessarily a derogatory term, but it was a used term for others. Even the term Moorish, for example. We were saying the Moors didn't call themselves Moors. They would call themselves the Almoravid dynasty or the Almohad dynasty, for example. So it's interesting how things get changed based off of who's viewing who and at what time period we're looking back on it then. I wanted to maybe bring up the Manil collection, but I don't want to go on too much of a.
Let's go.
Okay, let's go for it. So I mentioned earlier in my life how I kind of got interested in these topics. Later on, and maybe around the time of grad school, so we're talking 2009, I came across the Manil, the multi-volume series book, The Image of the Black in Western Art. What I learned through the Image of the Black in Western Art is this project of dealing with people of color from antiquity goes back very far. It goes back to the mid-1800s. And there was a German scholar, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name because I'm going to butcher it, but he was collecting images of artifacts from antiquity this was during the abolitionist movement in slavery, to potentially harken back to a more optimistic period in time of racial relations. The second generation of people who were dealing with this were Elaine Locke and Grace Hadley Beardley. Elaine Locke wrote the Negro. He was a Rhodes Scholar, the first, I think, Harvard Rhodes Scholar. And he was looking at these artifacts as well. And there's sort of a connection to what Cubism did in terms of expand, particularly the minds of Europeans, to the beauty of so-called primitive art, and how that opened up the minds of Europe to primitive and tribal art, and how they it basically birthed modern art. I mean, let's be real. if you look at Picasso's work, right? But there was also something happening with these artifacts as well. So you had Alain Locke and his collection and his writing on these artifacts. And then you had Dominique Vanille, who was collecting these artifacts during the Jim Crow era to counter anti-Black racism, to say, hey, look, it's in stark contrast to the Jim Crow era and the imaging of Black people during the Jim Crow era, to say, hey, look, these positive images, some of them were positive images of Black people from the past, could potentially point to mending racial relations in the now. So it blew my mind to realize how far back people were looking at these images and talking about this, and how I almost see myself now as like the fourth generation of this project. And I think there's no better way to incorporate these images into a fiction. Because again, we're sort of ignoring chronology in a lot of ways, and we're mashing up cultures, and like you mentioned, radical mixtures. What do we do with it now? So I think incorporating in art is the perfect thing to do with it.
Okay, so I'm sensing two like thorough lines about, again, you're honest about this, but about kind of executing some kind of formal, some techniques formally, this doing certain kind of work, but also in the background, you're making a comment on some other things. Could you share with us, what do you think it is that people misunderstand most about your work and your proofs?
I think, my work gets like politicized in two directions. I think some people come to my work and they say, okay, this is like a criticism of the canon. He's talking about how these, I think a lot of people get it wrong when they say like the blackamoors and images of people of color from antiquity were framed in the lens through racism. I don't think a lot of them were racist. Like if you go back even to the first image of the silent incantation painting, that was a bust made by Charles Cordier. It's part of like the Orientalist movement, right? And if these images were depicting like slaves and so on, or impoverished people maybe, then why are they wearing like turbans bedecked in jewels? And why are they made out of some of the most precious objects and materials that existed? Why were they so heavily sought after? Why were they made with such precious care and detail? So to me, that's where I derive like a form of empowerment from these objects. I'm like, oh my God, these are some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. So to kind of wrap it up, in one direction, I think people will kind of say, oh, this is a criticism of the canon. Like, look at how racist these European artists were to depict this, so on and so forth. And then I bring presentism back into the equation. The other is, it kind of deals with this whole movement of like kind of retconning history, like, oh, we were the original like kings of Europe, like we ruled Europe. It wasn't really like Henry VIII. It was like, so I think people will like go in either direction. And I think if it's totally fine to derive, again, like some notion of empowerment through the work I do myself. But I think there's no ideological bend with my work. There's no agenda in that sense. I'm not trying to rewrite the past. It's almost more of an homage to the past than a recontextualization. So I step to history with like a very open mind. And I have fun with it.
I appreciate you answering the question. You've given us a lot of, they're just visually stunning images to just behold. And I think this is a great time now to shift towards some of your forthcoming or works in progress.
Sure.
Can we get to the next image? Thank you so much. So what I understand is this is part of your project you're currently working on, Iceberg History. Mm-hmm. And again, it represents some of your kind of the corrections, revisions, interventions that you're seeking. Could you say how that percolates you?
So first of all, this is a work in progress. It's not finished. It's probably like 80% there, but as I was mentioning earlier, I started this painting in November. So I work on a bunch of different paintings at the time. I'm like 10 paintings right now. But it's been great to really, I've always used this analogy. I think I heard it from Cezanne, where it's as artists, we don't finish paintings, we abandon them. People always ask, when do you know painting's done? So I've actually really been challenging that notion and like not abandoning any work. Like, not that I would abandon it, but there's a time when you have to just like, you can pick the thing forever. You really can't. So I've been really like taking a lot more time with my work. So iceberg history. It's a term that I came up with that I'm using as sort of a catch-all phrase for this history that we've been discussing. And I use the metaphor for of an iceberg in the sense that the history that at least we focus on here in America, what's visible from let's say the bust up is, I would say, the last 400 years. And that history is rooted in upheaval and bound in a narrative of oppression. What about all this history we've been talking about? What led up to slavery, colonization, and so forth? I'm interested in what led up to that. I'm interested in investigating all of this history that I feel has been swept under the rug, overlooked, and even recently discovered. And the reason why I use it as a metaphor of an iceberg, one, because it's kind of hidden, and two, the depth to it goes back thousands of years. I think, like we mentioned in the conversation we had, if we focus on the last 400 years and we looked at that as like as a 12-year calendar, it would be like if we focused our history just in the month of December. We would leave out the other 11 months of the year, and you're missing out on such a rich and deep context that explains so much that I think would really change the way that people saw not only themselves but the world. Just for an example, during Europe's Dark Age, that was maybe a Christian Dark Age, but it was really an Islamic European Golden Age that lasted almost 1,000 years and really spurred the Renaissance movement. Why wasn't I taught about that in school, right? So that's just a small example of what, at least the three of us are aware of. And I think it's really changed the way that we approach not only like the realm of history and theater and the occult and alchemy and so on and so forth. So this is a project that I'm working on now, and I'm making a couple of these paintings. And this bust, it's kind of the fusion of a couple of different images, but the face itself comes from, I want to say, like the 3rd century BC from the Mediterranean area, and it's a depiction of an African.
So thank you so much for the preview. If we wanted to see complete versions in this series, actually about upcoming show, where would we go see them?
So you can see this painting when it's done at Monique Meloche Gallery. That's here in Chicago, and it'll be in November.
Excellent. I'm sure I'm not alone, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. I think this is a good time to shift towards Q&A. So any other questions from Zoom or from the audience?
I'm happy to get started with a quick question while people collect their thoughts, and I'm sure folks on Zoom as well have questions. But my question is for you, Cecilio, actually, as a specialist of the Black tonic, right, and the occult, the subterraneous, the surface. It's not just me. I think we all do that, right? We have those interests, we have those concepts we're deeply invested in and have been thinking about for a long time, and then we encounter artworks, fascinating, stunning artworks, and we they speak to those interests. And so I'd be curious to hear, when you look at Kajahl's work, how does that connect to this deep conceptual network that you're working with?
I appreciate that. So some of my, when I'm thinking about my work around the Black Chthonic or Chthonic various pronunciations, it's a Greco-Roman term just signaling just subsurface space. What is interesting about it, and I again think about this image, is that it includes both subterranean space, but also some aquatic space. So in some ways it's a geographic marker, but also chthonic is also something that is cosmological or religious in nature. Chthonic is, again, the subsurface space often references things like hell, evil, or just underground spaces for rhizomes, roots, caves, where maybe some kind of burrowing animals live. So phonic means lots of things, but also when I think about phonic, I think about deep time, about what kinds of narratives are made about time, longue durée projects. And particularly as someone, I work in art history, or I work in histories of science and medicine, as well as histories of art, but also my orientation is transdisciplinary in nature. And so I look for resonances and themes, and also trying to trouble methodologically how to approach those topics. So in some ways, when I look at images, I don't think the anachronism is a problem, but I know it is for certain kinds of approaches to art history, orthodox approaches to art history proper. So when I'm looking at it, I would say like there are overlaps for our approaches to work, but I think productive tensions. And so, for example, when I think about the chthonic or the subterranean, I look at images, I'm like, for example, I look at alchemical imagery. Their representations of Blackness and Black people in them, they've just been overlooked. And during this time period, I think because they don't fit a certain kind of narrative about maybe about harmony or the apolitical nature, or one of the things I'm looking at, the tension between racial and non-racial, that I think that the distinction between the two is untenable at this point. Particularly because not because the Blackness did not mean something, never meant something non-racial then, but that it's not possible for us at this moment to ever look back at that moment and not have that kind of lens on it, which I think is very much motivating, particularly in our history, when there's a dearth of actually Black art historians specializing in anything, or also just a dearth. You can write about representation of Black people and it not be about race, and we've seen that in productive ways. But I think what's interesting is about when you're speculating on work, I think the idea that you're pulling in geographic regions, like for example, the idea that everything that Black people or oppressed peoples of color, non-Black persons, was always about orientation to whiteness. What happens when you put these images from different traditions together in an image? What does that Janet's face do that you have? I think it's in Baroque icon one. Yeah.
The Baroque classic.
Thank you, the Baroque classic. What's happening there versus kind of the way, and I'm also very interested in what you're doing in perspective about, there's something about when the figure's gaze does not meet the viewer, when it's about being fetishized, it's about a kind of scopophilic gaze, versus when the gaze is averted. Sometimes it's about, and you mentioned Gustave, about a kind of opacity or denial, a kind of self-referentiality when I think about mirrors and symmetry. So I think there are all these kind of complicated things. And I totally get that. I appreciate, because some things you said about people misunderstood, it's interesting about how I approach your work, or how I think about our other people too. And so I think it makes a good opportunity to think about, for those of us who are very materially concerned, but also think about the speculative, what kinds of conversations can we have among Black descended, Black derived persons that's not necessarily about always being defensive. I appreciate having debates among ourselves as well as outside, but thank you for the question.
I can just piggyback really quickly. I mean, I have nothing to say, but I have an image that I think is connected to the point you were making, Cecilio, that I added because it was so gorgeous. This one from Kajahl's website, Cabinet of Curiosities. And of course, I mean, this is the most early modern thing, Baroque thing there is, right? The Cabinet of Curiosity. But what is striking to me is the taxonomy, separation, right? Each object is from a different culture, is fetishized, but put in its separate box. And what you do here is the opposite, right? Mash it all together. And that's really foundational technique for you. So it's a push and pull.
You know what actually got really I should mention this earlier, but one of the things that also got me on this whole kick of putting different civilizations together that maybe previously didn't have an interaction with each other, or possibly did, this gets into the speculative realm. We can talk about that. That made me think of another story, but I took a class when I was in grad school at Hunter, and it was a curatorial class. And the teacher said, if you want to like curate a show, I'm making this short, but if you want to curate a show, you can include any works of art you want to include into the show. It could be like a total fantasy show. And I was the only person that like went back into the ancient time and did that. But so the project was going into the Met and just curating a show around different objects that I could pull from anywhere I wanted to throughout the Met. This was also at the time when I discovered Fred Wilson's work. And what Fred Wilson was doing was going into museums and repurposing objects so that they told a different story. And it just clicked in my head when I saw that. So I also started to do research into history. And you walk into a museum, and I understand how architecture works. You have to like organize things in somewhat of a way when you step into a museum. But like the Greco-Roman world's over here, the Egyptian world's over here, the Semitic world's over here, the Asian world's over here. So when you step into a museum, because of how things are organized, it makes it seem like these cultures didn't interact with each other, appropriate from each other, and influence each other. And my research told me that, in fact, they absolutely did. And you mentioned just a minute ago, made me think of Black Athena, for example. And that's exactly kind of to a degree what Black Athena covers partially. So I thought, well, why don't I just mash all this stuff up and it can tell a different story that I think is more accurate than the story that the museum tells by segregating it. So let's not segregate history, let's integrate history and then tell a story about that integration. Not to get on too much attention, but you also made me think of combining kind of African with the pre-Columbian, which made me think of Ivan van Sertima before Columbus, and how he's proposing that Africans were coming over here to the New World prior to Columbus to reconnect with their long-lost ancestors, the Olmec. I'm kind of laughing what I'm saying, and you can maybe tell what I think about it. But I think that's so, just the fantasy of it, the fanciful encounter of these civilizations, particularly non-European civilizations, outside of that realm of colonization, et cetera, is really, really gets my imagination just going crazy. And I love that.
I can keep speaking, but I don't know if there are any questions.
Do we have questions?
Okay, I'll keep talking.
Go ahead. I'm going to check Zoom.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm glad, the Cabinet of Curiosities is really excellent. I also think about just like spatial, like how are these ideas around the way race or difference is visualized, how that is oriented spatially. And one is I think about the literal, you talked about the segregated spaces of the museum. I think specifically about the British Museum, about how the African artifacts were held off site for 100 years or so after the first public museum's inception. And then when it gets moved, it's literally put in the basement of the building. And so when I think about the founding too, I think about the idea of what Black people, the association between Blackness and Black people as being underground, as being relegated to being unimportant, as kind of an afterthought. Also thinking about the Underground Railroad, about just spaces of flight, including surveillance, but also thinking about Blackness as like the ground of referentiality, as opposed to an external imposition. If that is taken, so if we think about Blackness or Black people and Africanity as a way of grounding the conversation, then what is the Cabinet of Curiosities, a kind of ordering, kind of way of object that is resonant with Carl Linnaeus's way of ordering plants and peoples, and kind of universal system that we still use. Homo sapiens, we still, the way the two-part name system we still use today, and we try to disentangle from the racist elements of it. But the idea of like you orienting that Cabinet of Curiosities in a particular way, who's looking at it, what's in it, what is it systematizing, what is the order, is how violent is it, what is verticality doing there? And I'm not sensing a kind of way that you seem disinterested in hierarchy, but you're still playing with verticality in space in a particular kind of way. And I think that's interesting to think about, because part of me is just like, those are just fraught orientations, formal elements that you can't escape from, but maybe there's something like that.
There's actually a question in the Q&A that I think is connected to what you're saying, Cecilio. This is a question for both speakers. Is there any art collection, museum, or book that you would like to have the chance to remake, reorganize through the lens of the Black Baroque? So this is an organization.
I think about your filing system which sounds like really amazing, for all your images.
Yeah, rephrase the question again.
Sure.
Just kind of state it again.
Is there any art collection, and that can be a museum or a book, that you would like to have the chance to remake, reorganize through the lens of the Black
All of
Baroque?
them.
All of them.
Yeah, all of them. Give me it all. Yeah, I mean, like, the most exciting thing for me is when I discover a new artifact that I can use. Like that makes my day, makes my week if I come up with, you know, I call it a level 10 artifact. I mean, I'm always on the hunt for the rare, you know, when I discover a new bust, I'm just, oh, yes. And it just makes me wonder, like, what else is out there? You know, like one of the best experiences I ever had was, so with the Image of the Black archive, Image of the Black in Western art, it's an archive consisting of 45,000 images, and half of the digital archive is housed at the Warburg Institute in London, with the W.E.B. Hutchinson's Institute at Harvard. I might have butchered that a little bit. So I was in London some years ago, and I just like bullied my way into their archive. I like showed up. You need like all these access this and access that. I was like, yo, I'm an artist. This is my work. I'm really interested in this. Like, you have to go let me up and look at this archive. So I went up there, and there's just files and files of images, and I'm like blowing the dust off these things. And I'm just taking pictures, and I was just blown away. I came back the next day because it was so, I didn't even get through a fraction of it. And like, gold mine. Yeah, it was just incredible.
So what would you change if you were to reorganize that?
I don't understand the question of reorganize. I mean, I think this is it, right? What do they mean by reorganize? What do you think they mean by reorganizing?
Well, I mean, you reference in terms of you organize things by, I mean, the profile or the angle of the bust, and that is a nuance. A librarian would do something differently, or a curator would organize things differently. So your mind is working in that type of way.
Yeah.
How would you cluster them?
I mean, the reason why I'm clustering and organizing or reorganizing is just that when I go to collage things together, like, it's a different mindset than my organizational mindset. So the cleaner and organized that my files are, which are insane, just makes for a smooth process. Because I'm like, oh, where's that one image? And okay, it's enough. I can just kind of access it easier. But yeah, they're two totally different like modes of thinking: organization, vetting, searching, hunting, collaging.
And as a follow-up, might you be interested in some point at making your own archive, the way it is structured and organized, you know, following the way your framework? Might you be interested in some point at making that?
I mean, I'm not going to be able to
available?
use all these images, you know, like that I've collected. Just kind of like crazy to think about, but
maybe it'll be a resource down the line.
yeah, it probably will. Yeah, it's something that will live on.
A question about when you decide to use an image in your work, are you finished with it once it makes its appearance? Will it resurface in another work?
Good question. Yeah, no, when I use an image, I don't use it again. And then, so I really have to have like a level of certainty with the object or with the painting. I have to be sure that I'm using it in the right way. So.
We have sorry, I don't want to. Another question in the Q&A is, thank you so much for this art, gorgeous art, and for this fascinating conversation. I have literally a dozen questions, but I will limit myself to one. Do you think that there is any way your father's Garveism influenced your sense of history and aesthetics?
Yeah, probably on a more subconscious level for sure. Yeah, I can't like pinpoint how or why, but absolutely. Like, I'll talk to him and he'll say, yeah, when we were a kid, I used to like have this on in the background, or it was, you know, like a FireCon speech in the background. I'm like, what? I was sitting that when I was like 4. So I'm sure somewhere it's still there.
You guys want to listen to music when you paint?
Oh my God, absolutely. Yeah. I listen to a lot of history lectures too, music and history lectures. Yeah, a ton.
Yeah,
I'm studying while I'm working.
That's like a
Yeah, like YouTube changed everything, you know, like in 2009 when I entered grad school, that's kind of when YouTube really like hit the scene, and it really opened things up, and the internet really kind of exploded more so. So yeah.
History lectures. Well, that's quite something to listen to while you paint.
Oh,
It's very striking.
I'm not like sitting there taking notes, like retaining things, but like, yeah.
Let me respond to this right now.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking the questions. Do we have more questions in the room? Because I have one, but I don't want to monopolize the.
I have another. I'm just thinking about, you find these images and there's probably an orientation because it's two-dimensional archival photo sculpture. Are you thinking about like maybe what's on the other side of that headpiece or bust, like, because you're thinking about orientation. So I'm looking at this, I guess, mask, headdress. I'm thinking about what the other side might look like. And are you making exact replicas, or are you kind of dreaming about what the verso side might look like and then incorporating that in any way?
Well, like with the silent incantation painting, that was multiple photographs of the same bust. So I found the image of it from the front and then the back. So I oftentimes are able to find images from multiple sides, multiple angles of the same object. So playing around with that is something that, but in terms of like, we're trying to like recreate what that unseen side is, it's not something that
Maybe with the icebergs. I'm just thinking about kind of like what is beneath the surface or behind the work that we're not seeing. So
something to think about. Yeah.
I know that the digital collage is a part of your process to complete projects, but do you ever think that maybe in the future you will have, I don't know, maybe a publication of the making of? Because like just thinking that like there's this whole other artistic version out there of these wonderful paintings that you have. Like I want to see what that looks like in a choppy, photographic, collage. And I'm wondering if you ever think that you might do something along the line where we can see if those work.
My initial reaction is like, no. My initial feeling is to like keep them hidden. I think I mentioned that I think I'd rather them obsolete. So I almost feel like it would diminish the value of the painting. But I'm sure like I know people like to see insight into the process and kind of how the thing's made. But it's something I've always kept like pretty private.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
As you look at your practice and the problem for a while, what do you think the next evolution is going to be? Where are you going to push yourself next?
Well, you saw the painting that I'm working on now. That's sort of the scene. You mentioned Subterranea, and I'm actually also painting these like ocean dweller, these figures that are in like coral reefs, and there were a lot of bronze busts and oil lamps and things that were, and they look like they've been kind of aged by not only time but by like the salt water and so on. So, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the work will go, but I like the idea that I'm not 100% sure. But I mean, I'm always pushing it. I always want to like kind of surprise and challenge myself. So we'll see. I have a lot of ideas, and I feel like I don't have a lot of time, which is a good problem to have.
I appreciate that.
I have another question about time, actually, which is about the place of the future and in the way you engage with history. And another image I had added on the PowerPoint because I thought it's quite striking is this one. Which actually, Cecilio, when you said that you're interested in encoding, I was like, ooh, it's there. But yeah, it's quite striking. What stands out to me is this idea of technology, science that is resonant with futurity, right? And almost, it sounds like, okay, my question is not super articulate, but hopefully, no, you'll be able to follow it. I'm thinking Afrofuturism, right, versus Black Baroque. I'm thinking speculation, you're interested in speculation, using it as a technique, it's so crucial to you, and that's also a crucial element for Afrofuturism and imagining other Black futures, right? So I'm wondering how you see, what is the place of the future is in your thinking? Is there a way in which, oddly enough, you're turning to the past as also a turning to the future?
Yeah, I would say so. I was thinking about kind of quantum mechanics or quantum science in relation to a lot of like tribal, not tribal aesthetics, but what's the word? not methodologies, but there's a connection between, I think, a lot of indigenous cultures and their use of alternate realities or altered states of consciousness, and that relationship to what a lot of these quantum scientists are like discovering. And I think they already had it all figured out. And quantum science, I hope I'm saying all this right. Quantum science is kind of catching up to what we've already known for thousands of years. They're just, proving it through numbers. So I thought scarification was like this form of quantum, visual form of quantum. And then the literal science equation. So like there's the kind of connection between the two. Yeah, I get that. Sorry. No, I get the term Afrofuturism thrown at me, or not thrown at me, but are you Afrofuturist? And I've never seen myself as that. But I am like, I think I really relate to like Octavia Butler and Sun Ra in the sense that they didn't describe themselves as Afrofuturism. It was a term that got, like, I think Mark Derry termed it in like the early 90s, and it got kind of thrown onto them. And I sort of feel that same way. In terms of like the future, I am interested in what human identity will look like in the future, what our identity will look like in the future. And I think that is that like idea of going back to the past to glean some sort of insight into the future.
Baroque futures.
I'm wondering, what is the highest compliment you've received as an artist? And to clarify, I know you've had different public spaces, so you've been written about or reviews. And I'm wondering if there are any words that you've ever seen about your work from someone who has consumed it that made you think like, oh, they got it, or like, if only I could live up to that, how you see me.
I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. It's funny you asked that. So I used to have a studio in like on the Bushwick Bed-Stuy border in New York, and it was a storefront property. It was just right on the ground, so there were like two big doors that opened up. And it was just a neighborhood or whatever. And I would keep the doors open, so people would just come into my studio sometimes, and I would just let them. Like it could have been anybody, but I didn't mind it. Like I liked the reaction people got when they walked in and saw these paintings on the wall, right? So to answer your question, this mother and daughter came into my studio. The daughter, she was about 4 or 5 years old. She just walks around, she looks at all the paintings, she pauses for a minute, and then she goes, "Look, Mom, these are spirits," and then just walks out. But I'm like, this 5-year-old girl, she got it. She didn't need to read this dense academic text. She didn't need to like have any understanding of art history or the contemporary art market. She walked in, she saw it, and she got it. And that was, to me, probably like the coolest thing that I think anybody ever said to me.
That's beautiful. All right, and do we have maybe we have time for one final question if someone wants to ask.
I think we can end on that.
Yeah, I mean, we cannot top that. So thank you so much. Thank you, Cecilio. Thank you, good job.